The week that I'd spent in Las Vegas in November of 2013 had convinced me that I'd found my future. Saying goodbye to Lindsay at the end of that visit had been one of the most difficult things I'd ever had to do. We'd not discussed our feelings for each other, and as such, neither of us knew whether or not those feelings were mutual. Hell, given the circumstances, it seemed impossible that they could be. Nevertheless, I returned to Arkansas determined to make all of the necessary preparations for moving to Las Vegas because, if nothing else, I wanted to be closer to my best friend, even if that was all we would ever be.
In January of 2014, I found myself concerned about my own future, wondering how I was able to pay the bills and what would happen next. It seemed like everything was going wrong, and then Charles asked if he could rent out my guest room because he wanted to move to Vegas. To be honest, it seemed too good to be true, and the skeptic in me refused to believe that it would ever actually happen, right up until the night I picked him up from the airport. I'd been burned by roommates in the past, so even though I trusted him and needed a roommate just as much as he needed a place to stay, I felt compelled to take precautions and do things by the book.
She told me right away that if I was going to move into her guest room, that I would need to sign a lease, and I didn't see any problem with that at all. She sent me the lease in advance so that I could go over it and make sure I was comfortable with all of the terms. For the most part, it was a pretty standard lease with ordinary things like first and last month's rent, descriptions of my designated living spaces, and a ban on illegal substances. I couldn't find anything in the lease that would make me change my mind about signing it, but there was one clause that had me more than a little worried, one that I am fairly certain no other lease in the history of legal documents has ever contained.
Tenant agrees to actively and ceaselessly seek to obtain lawful and gainful employment upon his arrival at premises, and further agrees that should he be unable to do so, tenant shall forfeit the remaining terms of this agreement and vacate premises of himself and all of his belongings, and tenant shall surrender all or part of his security deposit as needed for the purpose of securing valid transportation to his previous place of residence in Arkansas.
In other words, if I didn't find a job fast, she was going to ship my ass back to Arkansas. I understood her reason for adding the clause to the lease, especially given her previous circumstances, and I found it rather funny, but I will also admit that I was nervous. I had no idea what the job market would be like in Vegas or whether or not I would be able to find something quickly. Still, being with her was worth the gamble, and I knew that I was going to do whatever I had to do to stay.
On the very first day, he spent close to 9 uninterrupted hours filling out online applications for every retail and food service position within a 10-mile radius. By the time I got off work that day, he already had an interview lined up for that evening, and I offered to give him a ride. We went to dinner after the interview, and he ended up filling out an application for the restaurant while we were eating. I had honestly never seen someone so determined before in my life, and it reminded me a lot of myself when I job hunted in the past.
By the end of the 2 week mark, the good news finally came. I'd gone to an interview and been hired on the spot. The relief that I felt was something I couldn't even put into words. It had only been 2 weeks, but we had already fallen into this natural pattern of behavior around one another. Life as roommates felt comfortable, familiar, like it had been years instead of weeks. We had nearly everything in common, we could talk about virtually anything, and I never got tired of being around her. I didn't tell her until much later, but I had decided that even if I hadn't found work and she kicked me out, I wouldn't have gotten on that plane. I would have found some way, somehow, to stay in Vegas with her. I could feel it deep in my bones. We belonged together like destiny.
I didn't tell him until much later, but I had decided that even if he hadn't found work right away, I wasn't really going to kick him out, which is why I'd never put an actual time limit in the contract. That, and I knew it would never have held up in court anyway. In just 2 weeks, I'd grown accustomed to having him around. No, actually, that's not right. It was more like I'd already been accustomed to having him around. Like putting your favorite pair of comfortable slippers on at the end of a long day, or reuniting with your family after a prolonged absence. I wanted to rip up the contract and tell him that he belonged here and that we belonged together forever, but I still just didn't know how to let him know that I wanted more than friendship.